invoking the saying that was shared when the ark was on the move. But for our purposes, at the very least, right, regardless of whether or not we can prove that it was written at that time, at the very least, it is a prayer for God to move. It is a prayer for God to act in a way consistent with the ark being moved. Like, God, move and act in that way. As we look at verses 2 and 3 in this stanza, it essentially outlines the program found in Psalm 1. You know, if we go back to Psalm 1, it says that God watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. The way of the wicked leads to destruction. Look at Psalm 68, 2 and 3. May you blow them away like smoke as wax melts before the fire. May the wicked perish before God. That is, again, very similar language to Psalm 1:6. But may the righteous be glad. May you watch over the righteous, and may they rejoice before God. May they be happy and joyful. So God, in your movement, accomplish your purpose, that you will watch over the way of the righteous, and in your movement also ensure that the way of the wicked will perish. And that's how our psalm begins. It's an invocation for God to be on the move. Stanza 2, verses 4 through 6, is an invitation to praise because of God's movement. Verse 4 says, sing to God, sing in praise of his name. And the idea here is because God is moving, we should praise him. There's many similarities here in verses, especially verse 4, with Psalm 29. We looked at Psalm 29 together. It was actually on a Sunday morning that we did that. But there's a lot of similarities there. In verse 4, remember I said there was a translation issue, and the translation issue has to do with the phrase rider on the clouds. So verse 4 says, sing to God, sing in praise of his name, extol him who rides on the clouds. And if you remember what I said from the Sunday talking about Psalm 29, Psalm 29 portrays the Lord as the one who rides on the clouds, that he is the storm God. He's the one who causes storms. He's the one who brings storms. He's the Lord of the storm. Well, that was the main Canaanite god's role and responsibility. And in fact, he was often referred to as the rider on the clouds. And here's the reason why there's translation issues here. The Hebrew scribes were very careful to protect the name of God, and they were very careful to distance themselves from idolatry. And there's clear indications of that in the text, that they were purposefully changing things in order to protect God's glory and his holiness, and to not like name idols. So let me give you some examples. One Rod brought up a couple of weeks ago. We don't know how the Lord's name's pronounced because they've kind of protected it. They've taken it away. They've protected the way the Lord's name was pronounced by transposing different vowels that shouldn't be there. They put them in there. And so that's one way. There was there's a man in the book of Samuel, and in the Hebrew text, his name is Ishbosheth. Well, Ishbosheth means man of shame. But in all of the translations that were prior to, the Masoretic scribes writing this down, his name is Ishbaal. So it's clear that the Masoretic scribes didn't want to put the name Baal in there, so they changed it to Bosheth, which means shame. So instead of Ishbaal, which is man of Baal, they made his name Ishbosheth, man of shame. So because Baal is shameful. He's so shameful, we're not even going to put his name in here. Well, again, rider on the clouds was a common ascription. It was like, who's Baal? He's the rider of the clouds. He's the rider on the clouds. And so there's a real slight change in the word. So if you have the ESV, it says the rider on the desert, or the rider on the desert highlands, right? It's like the steppe, the STEPPE. But that's a super slight variation, and the ancient translations have clouds. So again, it seems here that there was that real slight manipulation, because they didn't want to say God's the writer of the clouds. What Baal is, that's shameful, and we don't want to ascribe that idolatrous sort of notion to him. But it appears that that was what the original text, that he really is truly the rider of the clouds. So the Lord rides the clouds, and it's interesting here to see what happens when he moves. So when the Lord goes to work, when the Lord moves and rides the clouds, verses 5 and 6 tell us that he becomes a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. In other words, he answers the prayer of verses 1 through 3. He watches over the way of the righteous, but he opposes the way of the wicked. So the Lord rides the clouds to defend the widow and adopt the orphan. In Canaanite mythology, Baal rides the clouds to make people rich, fat, and happy, right? Like, you're just going to make us abundantly rich. You're going to fill up our bank accounts. We're going to be fat because we're going to be eating all this food and drinking all this wine, and we're going to just be happy. But the Lord's movement is for different purposes. And it's not that he doesn't want us to be happy, right? I mean, he even says here in verse 3, may the righteous be happy. So it's not as if he's opposed to it, but he is ultimately for justice. He is ultimately for establishing a just, upright kingdom, which ultimately would lead to the greatest happiness. It's not a self-serving happiness, which is what Baal was. Baal was essentially, he was there to make people feel self-servingly happy. I mean, even his worship, it's despicable to even speak of the ways that Baal was worshipped. I mean, truly, there's not a R or even X-rated movie that would do justice to the way Baal was worshipped. So his worship, the theology around Baal was really for self-serving personal satisfaction, whereas now we see the reason God rides on the clouds is to defend the poor and establish a just and upright kingdom. Stanza 3, verses 7 to 18, relates the benefits of God's movement. God moves, but in this stanza, it's interesting. There's a movement sort of down. It's much like a descent to lead his people and to lead them up to where he is. And he fights, he descends to lead his people, and he fights on their behalf. God then ascends to his sanctuary, leading a group of captives. So he's come to fight on their behalf. He has released them from their captivity. He ascends again to his sanctuary, only this time he's ascending to his sanctuary with the group of captives that he's just set free, and he's receiving gifts, tributes, that is spoil from all people. So just like a conquering king not only gets to accomplish and achieve their purposes, they get spoil from it. They are able to get gifts and tributes. And so the sort of theme and movement of this stanza 7 to 18 is God descending to lead and guide his people so that he can lead them up to where he is. And he's leading this group of captives, receiving spoil from all people. And the ascending is to his dwelling place, which is his sanctuary. Which, because let's look at verses 17 and 18 together. It says, the chariots of God are tens of thousands and thousands of thousands.